Hi guys, happy Friday and happy first day of May. I am back again with some more of our read aloud, Chasing Vermeer, written by Blue Balliett and illustrated by Brett Helquist. Today will be part 9, so I hope that you have been listening along. If you have missed any parts, you can click down to my page, and there's a playlist titled Chasing Vermeer where you can catch up before listening to this portion. Today we are going to be starting with Chapter 13, X the Experts. The next morning they had another surprise. This one came from Miss Hussey. She asked her students to think about what they might have done if the thief had written them a personal letter before the theft took place, a letter delivered to their home. "You mean like one of the 3 letters the thief talked about?" asked Calder. "Not necessarily. We're just inventing a situation," Miss Hussey answered, with some of her old "we're in this together and it might be dangerous" tone. Hearing the undercurrent of excitement, her class grew quiet. Miss Hussey went on to explain that this letter would have asked anonymously for their help. Say the thief had offered lots of money, promised that the cause was honorable, and, last but not least, threatened their life if they showed the letter to anyone else. Petra scribbled Calder a quick note. "The letter that blew away from me that day on Harper Avenue? It sounded just like this, except I didn't get to finish it, and I don't remember the threat." As Calder read Petra's note, Miss Hussey was saying, "This is a question of judgment. It's not clear, in your letter, if the thief is good or bad. I'm interested in what you might do. And, Calder, could I keep that, please? You know I don't allow those kinds of communications during class." Calder flashed an "uh-oh" look at Petra, who had slumped down in her seat. He stepped carefully over Denise's outstretched foot as he handed Miss Hussey the note. She popped it in her pocket. Although she knew Miss Hussey wouldn't be angry, Petra had a queasy feeling. How could the letter Miss Hussey was asking them to imagine sound so similar to the one about art and crime? But maybe this was just another coincidence, pure and simple. There had been so many lately. Or maybe Miss Hussey had found the letter blowing around too. Of course, the thought was a relief. Petra sat up. Miss Hussey wrote some of their responses on the blackboard. Go directly to the police and get protection. Hide the letter and try to figure out who the writer was. Change the locks on the doors. Do what was asked, have an adventure, and hope you weren't breaking the law. Tell a friend and make them promise not to tell, and then talk about what to do. Miss Hussey listened closely to what the kids were saying, as she always did. At the last suggestion, her eyes suddenly filled with tears. Then, just as quickly, they were gone, and she was muttering something about dirt in her eye. Out in the hallway, Calder looked upset. He said to Petra, "Do you suppose Miss Hussey got one of the 3 letters and dropped it or something, and you picked it up? What if she's kind of looking for help by asking us what we think? But why would the thief ask her to help him? I mean, she's just a 6th grade teacher." Petra's voice sounded unsure. "Good people sometimes get caught in bad things." Calder was thinking now about Tommy, about Frog, about Petra's dad, about Vermeer himself. Should Miss Hussey be added to the list? As if he or she were playing on Petra and Calder's fears, the thief resurfaced the next morning. A full-page ad appeared in newspapers around the world. After the thief's first published letter, the fuss over a lady writing had been tremendous. The catchy phrase, "You will come to agree with me," the message found inside the packaging box after the painting was stolen, had been picked up everywhere. It appeared spray-painted on subway cars, on walls, and on the sides of buildings in New York City, in Chicago, in Tokyo, in Amsterdam. It turned up on cheap t-shirts in English, Dutch, French, Spanish, even Japanese. Demonstrations were organized outside several museums, and protesters were photographed marching and shouting. There was footage on the evening news of signs that said things like, "Tell the truth, get her back," or "X the experts," or "Viva Vermeer, solamente la verdad." Museum officials had days when they had to scurry, protected by the police, through noisy crowds to get to work. It was after this first wave of passion began to die down that the first full-page ad appeared. It said simply, "You are doing the right thing." Sure enough, the response from the public was instantaneous. There was more mail, there was more publicity. The next time the public seemed to be losing interest, another message appeared, saying, "Be patient, do not give up." This also was followed by a flood of letters. The ad that Calder and Petra read before school that morning in the Chicago Tribune said, You have come to agree with me. They will come to agree with you." In tiny print below the letter, newspaper editors, under pressure from the FBI, the police, and a committee of museum directors, explained that they would not publish any more of the mysterious advertisements. This was the last. The first advertisement was mailed from New York a week after the theft, the second from Florence a week after that, and the third from Amsterdam. The thief almost seemed to be showing off, thumbing his nose at the authorities. Miss Hussey said nothing to Petra that morning about the note she had pocketed the day before. Maybe she hadn't even read it, Petra thought with relief. Class began with a discussion about the thief's latest ad. Miss Hussey asked, "Why do people assume the thief is just one person? I mean, couldn't this be a group?" She was absent-mindedly twisting her ponytail around and around one thumb. Calder raised his hand. "Don't the police think 3 other people are helping?" "I don't know," Miss Hussey said. "Do they? I guess it depends on what is considered helping, and whether those 3 letters even exist." She looked so genuinely concerned that Petra and Calder began to wonder if they had jumped to silly conclusions the day before. One thing was clear to the 6th graders. In spite of their discussions earlier in the year with Miss Hussey, the letter as a form of communication was very much alive. Chapter 14, Flashing Lights. Calder arrived at Powell's that afternoon just as Mr. Watch was folding the top closed on a large paper bag. He nodded to Calder and began lettering SHAR with an indelible marker on the outside. Before Calder could say anything, Mr. Watch pointed toward a massive pile of children's picture books. "Need to be shelved." He turned back toward the bag and added P.E. "But I'd like to deliver that," Calder blurted. "I mean, she's nice," he added lamely. "Nice?" he thought to himself. "Hardly." Mr. Watch stood up and adjusted his suspenders. "I can drop them off myself after work." Calder looked miserably at the picture books. When Mr. Watch went to use the bathroom, Calder rushed over to the bag and peeked inside. They didn't look like the kinds of books most people would bother. They didn't look like the kinds of books most people would bother with. There were several on the history of mathematics, a book called On the Plurality of Worlds, and another called The Roots of Coincidence. Calder heard the toilet flush and hurriedly closed the top of the bag. Funny that Mrs. Sharp was also thinking about coincidences. He worked extra quickly on shelving the picture books and returned to the front desk. Mr. Watch was surprised and gave him a smile that revealed a row of small pointed teeth. No wonder the man usually kept his mouth closed. "Need that delivery now?" Calder asked. Mr. Watch shrugged. "Fine," he said, then reached into his pocket as if to find something. "Wait, no, never mind, go ahead." Calder hurried south on Harper Avenue. Should he stop at Petra's and let her know where he was going just in case something happened? No, that was ridiculous. When the door opened, Calder was surprised to see Mrs. Sharp looking almost friendly. The wrinkles on her face were arranged into something that resembled a smile. "Come in while I get a check for you, boy." Calder was left to look around again for several moments. This woman had money, no doubt about it. What did she do all day? Calder noticed the hefty pile of papers next to her computer. They were too big to sit on her desk, and had their own fold-out table. Maybe she was a writer? A writer and a thief? When Mrs. Sharp returned, Calder shifted his weight from one foot to the other, hoping she'd get the hint. She paused to look at his feet, as if there was something wrong with them. Calder took the plunge. "Mrs. Sharp, would it be possible for me to use your bathroom? I'm not feeling well." Mrs. Sharp waved a bony hand behind herself. Up the stairs, turn left. Then she gave Calder a hawk-like glance, as if to say, "I'm old, but I'm not that old." Calder, sweating already, scurried up the stairs. They creaked horribly under his boots. Once at the top, he paused, trying to take in as much as possible. Sure enough, to his right, he saw a large standing wardrobe. The perfect storage place. It looked almost identical to the one behind the geographer in Vermeer's painting. Mrs. Sharp's voice came from downstairs. "The switch is high. Inside the door?" "Got it," Calder called back, fumbling on the wall inside the first room he came to. The light went on in a huge bedroom. There was another wardrobe with carved panels, this one covering most of the far wall. "Oops," Calder called down, trying to sound lost. He was back out in the hall, the bedroom light off. The bathroom. Calder shut the door, flushed hurriedly, and took several deep breaths. On his way down the stairs, he noticed a built-in cabinet with heavy drawers beneath an old bench on the landing. The house was nothing but wooden storage places. "Thanks, Mrs. Sharp," Calder said, realizing he probably didn't have to overdo it on not looking well. He stuffed the check in his pocket. "See you soon." The front door was closed almost before he was out of it. The old woman clearly wasn't big on goodbyes. Calder went directly to Petra's and invited her back to his house. It was quieter there, and they had to get his discoveries written down. Petra carried the Vermeer notebook. On the way over, she said happily, "My dad just got home. He was doing some kind of research for his department. Strange it had to be so secret, isn't it?" "Not so strange," Calder mumbled. "Secrets seem almost normal these days." Together they sat on the floor in Calder's room. First, Petra wrote down the titles of the books Calder remembered from Mrs. Sharp's bag. Then, Calder sketched the standing wardrobes. They each ate several blue ones before there was a knock at the door. "Calder, a letter for you." His dad gave them a quick smile. "Looks like another one from Tommy." Calder tore it open and began decoding as Petra watched, fascinated. "How did you learn to do that?" she asked. "I made it up," he said, glad she happened to see. Then he began to understand what he was reading. It said, "And we have to decode another letter from Tommy to Calder." So I'll again speed along as I do so. Alright, so this letter we have Calder. "Fred moved out. We want to come home, but no money. Tommy." Whoa. "Petra, there's something else we've got to do. We've got to rescue Tommy." Calder and Petra spent most of the weekend baking brownies and selling them on Harbor Avenue. They explained to the neighbors that they were raising money for Tommy Segovia and his mom Zelda to come home because Tommy's new stepfather had deserted his family in New York. "There one day, gone the next," was Calder's way of putting it. Everyone was sympathetic, and everyone bought. Late Sunday afternoon, as the grand total of $129 was being stuffed into several coffee cans to go to the bank, there was news about the theft. The news was local. According to the evening broadcast, an elderly woman in Chicago had just notified the authorities about receiving a strange delivery. That delivery was a letter that arrived back in October, and that woman was Louise Coffin Sharp. She was asking for police protection. "What?" shouted Petra and Calder together. They dropped the jar of quarters they'd been counting and rushed around the corner to where Calder's parents were watching TV in the next room. The broadcaster read the letter aloud. Petra and Calder stared at each other. It sounded exactly like the letter Miss Hussey had described to her class. The broadcaster explained that for an older woman living on her own, it had required an act of great courage to finally take the letter to the police. The broadcaster clearly had never met Mrs. Sharp. Oh my God. The letter was delivered right down the block. Calder's mom clapped her hand to her forehead. "And Calder, you were just over there." "Mrs. Sharp is involved," Calder said to Petra in a low voice. "Do you think she was waiting all that time for the thief to get back in touch with her?" "Who can tell? And think of Miss Hussey's letter. This can't be pure coincidence," Petra said. "It's too close." "Do you remember that Louise Sharp's husband was a Vermeer scholar? Calder's dad said to his mom. "What?" Calder and Petra asked in one voice. Calder's dad said he remembered hearing that Mrs. Sharp's husband had been murdered in Europe many decades ago, and that he had been doing research on Vermeer at the time of his death. Calder and Petra stared at each other. "Murdered how, Dad?" Calder asked. "I don't remember, but I think it was considered a random street crime. A horrible case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They never arrested anyone." "Poor Mrs. Sharp," Petra said. "Well, that could explain some of her odd behavior." "And maybe more," Calder added. The phones rang nonstop all over Hyde Park that night. Looking out his living room window after Petra went home, Calder could see the blue flash of police cars and knew they must be stationed outside Mrs. Sharp's house. She'd be safe, no question about that. A nagging doubt crept into Calder's mind. Could Mrs. Sharp be so clever that she had framed herself? He wouldn't put it past her. Even though her husband had been killed, it was hard to picture her being afraid so many years later. And Miss Hussey, what was going on with her? The pieces just didn't fit. Petra, 3 houses away, followed the flashing lights on her ceiling, her thoughts falling into rhythm with a pulse of blue. What about the letter she had picked up that day on Harper Avenue? Had that been one of the original 3? Was Mrs. Sharp really a victim now? Was Miss Hussey? Petra's thoughts swirled in circles, refusing to make sense. And that's where we're going to stop for today. We'll be back we'll be back Monday with chapter 15, which is called Murder and Hot Chocolate. I hope that you are enjoying the story. Lots of mysterious things going on. I hope that you have an excellent weekend, and I look forward to seeing you back on Monday. Goodbye.